afterwards. Okay, so it's good to see everyone tonight. Thank you for joining us. And it's a pleasure to have with us tonight Ben Sales speaking to us, joining us virtually. So Ben covers anti-Semitism as well as American Jewish affairs for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Previously, he was JTA's Israel correspondent, and he was based in Tel Aviv. He's reported from 10 different countries and is the former editor of New Voices magazine and lives in New York City. So I've known Ben for a long time. I think we met when we were both in college. And it's really wonderful to have you joining us this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute you now. So I know you also want to say some introductory remarks before we get started.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you all for having me virtually. Cleveland has a special place in my heart because I had a few friends from Beechwood in college. And the first time I was there, actually, I visited one summer in 2007 when the Cavs had a long playoff run. So that was a nice memory. And the last time I was in Cleveland actually was for the Republican convention in 2016, which was just 4 years ago, of course, but feels like much longer ago. And I hope to come back soon in person, but for the meantime, it is great to be here virtually. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and talking to you about the Jewish news. And just one more thing, for those who aren't familiar with JTA, we're a Jewish newswire that syndicates articles to about 70 different papers around the country and Israel and internationally as well. So we're like the Associated Press for Jewish newspapers.
And I'll say including the Cleveland Jewish News.
Including Cleveland Jewish News, yes, very much, yes.
So one of the perhaps the most surprising piece of news that's come out over the last week and a half now has been the news about the historic agreement between Israel and the UAE. Could you give us a little bit of background about this deal and why it was that we've heard for a number of years now that there were secret ties, secret discussions between Israel and a number of the Gulf states. So why is the UAE the first Gulf state to recognize Israel?
Sure, yeah. First of all, before we get into the particulars, I want to just note that you're right about how historic it is. I think that oftentimes in the back and forth, especially with how fast the news cycle moves nowadays, we kind of get lost in the details of, is this good for X or bad for Y? And those things are important, but to me, the most significant thing about this is that Israel now has a treaty and normalization with a third country in the region, which is historic. When Israel was founded, of course, none of its neighbors recognized it, none of its neighbors wanted it to exist, and it fought war after war after war to stave that off, and did stave it off successfully. Up until now, there are only two countries, Egypt and Jordan, that have peace agreements and normalization with Israel. Normalization, by the way, for those who don't know, it means you have ambassadors in each country and embassies in each country. You can travel between the countries, you can trade, any kind of normal relations between two countries, right? So Israel, that's still a rarity for Israel. And Israel is a prosperous country, and it's a country that's lived in safety for the past several years. But let's not lose sight of how historic it is that it now has relations with a third country. Over the long view of Israeli history, that's still a big deal. So to answer your question more directly, the UAE and Israel have actually been pursuing relations since the mid-90s. Basically, when Israel signed the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians, which was the interim agreement Israel signed with the Palestinians in 1993, that kind of opened the door for relations with the wider Arab world, because the Arab world had basically said, until there's a resolution with the Palestinians, we're not gonna have relations with Israel. And because Oslo appeared at the time to be the first step in that process of peace with the Palestinians, Arab countries began kind of tentatively reaching out to Israel. And one of the first ones, and one of the most aggressive ones over the last 25 or so years, has been the UAE, for a few reasons. First of all, they saw a benefit and continue to see a benefit in Israeli defense technology and in having access to that and kind of a back and forth in that respect. The second thing more recently, over the past couple of decades, and especially the last decade, is that Israel and the Gulf states, the small kingdoms and Saudi Arabia that are on the Persian Gulf, have a shared enemy in, or shared adversary at least, in Iran. So, Israel has made it a priority, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it a priority for at least the past decade and longer to confront Iran's nuclear ambitions. And for the Gulf states, which are Sunni Muslim states, it's also a priority to combat Iran, which is a Shia Arab country. So, Shia Muslim country, forgive me. So those two, that divide, the Shia-Sunni divide, is significant to them. And so they see in Israel kind of an enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. The third thing that spurred this along now, actually two more factors that spurred this along now are the coronavirus, that the countries see a shared goal in combating that and working toward a vaccine. And the last thing is that Israel has been, or the Israeli government has talked about annexing parts of the West Bank for the past year or so, and had declared its intention to do that. The UAE wanted to forestall that, and so they saw this as an opportunity to do that. That gets into a wider conversation of how the Palestinians figure into it, which we can talk about, but let's stop there. And yeah.
Okay, so I'm actually going to sort of pick up then on where you left off and
Sure.
ask a follow-up question, which is, how does this impact the Israeli-Palestinian relations, and to what extent were the Palestinians, or at least or some Palestinian factions, involved or not involved in this deal?
That's a good question. So, like I said, basically until now, until this deal, the assumption was in Israel's relations with the Middle East that it wasn't going to have a treaty or normal relations with other Arab and Muslim countries in the region until it sorted out the Palestinian issue. And for a long time, that was kind of an incentive to Israel to reach an agreement with the Palestinians, and Israelis who supported reaching a deal with the Palestinians and supported a two-state solution said that that was one of the biggest reasons why they wanted that, was because once you get that, that opens the door to wider relations with the Arab world. And that stopped being true basically this week. It's no secret that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues to fester, and right now there's absolutely no progress between the two sides to a mutual deal. The Trump administration and the Netanyahu government are on the same page, but the Palestinians very much are not. And so, there's really been no movement forward on that for a long time. And Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, has talked a lot about, let's not wait for the Palestinians to strike deals and sign treaties with other countries in the region, with other Arab countries and other Muslim countries. People basically said he wasn't going to be able to do it, but it seems like in the past few years there's been an increasing appetite among these countries for the reasons I mentioned, because of Iran, because of shared technology, all that stuff. There's been an increasing willingness of these countries in the region to say, let's find some kind of accommodation with Israel, even if they don't solve the Palestinian conflict first. And that's what happened now. So the way the Palestinians figure into this is that they were kind of left behind here. And they feel betrayed because they really thought that the rest of the Arab world was going to be in their corner. And that became a little less true this week. And, there are reports now, and that's all they are for now, because until things are done, they're not done. But there are reports now that Israel's going to move forward on signing agreements with other countries in the Gulf, other Middle Eastern countries, with Sudan maybe, which is in North Africa. So there's really movement here, and yeah, that's where it is. In terms of Palestinian involvement in this, I don't think there really was much. I mean, I think they're really, like, the Palestinian leadership, especially Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, is really trying to find where his place is here and where he fits in now that this agreement has been signed.
And how does this agreement impact internal Israeli politics? We've been hearing a lot about the possibility that there might be a fourth election in, I guess, a little over a year, and that Netanyahu's coalition is on the verge of collapse. Does this strengthen Netanyahu's hand?
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu's coalition is always on the verge of collapse, and it has been for, the nature of Israeli coalition governments is that in some sense they're always on the verge of collapse. But it's really unclear, because the reasons why the government was on the verge of collapse didn't really have anything to do with foreign policy or even with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, really. They had to do with anger and conflict internally over how Israel was handling the pandemic, and kind of connected to that, how Israel was handling its economic crisis as a result of the pandemic. And also, you have to mention that Netanyahu is currently on trial for corruption, which is a first in Israeli politics. A sitting prime minister has never sat trial for corruption before. So all of those things still exist. This is certainly an achievement for Netanyahu, right? And it puts him in an exclusive pantheon of Israeli leaders that have signed agreements with Arab nations, but those internal problems are still there. So to the extent that those still exist, there could still be elections. As to whether this strengthens his hand, a poll that came out right after this deal was announced showed that he had a slight uptick in the polls. But these things are really volatile. So, it depends what happens over the next few weeks, over the next couple months, and, we'll see.
You mentioned also that a lot of the challenges Netanyahu is facing now, there's the corruption trial, but also has to do with the way Israel's handled the COVID pandemic. And obviously, I think Israel and Jewish communities around the world took a lot of pride in the way Israel tackled the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic. Can you help us understand a little bit about why the second wave seems to have been so much more challenging for Israel to handle?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question. I wish I had a good answer. I don't think anyone really has a good answer. The few things that I've kind of read and gleaned from afar, I'm in the United States, of course, are that Israel was doing extremely well, enviably well, with COVID back in May. But since then, it kind of opened up really quickly. And I think that led to an uptick again. It definitely led to an uptick in cases. There's been a marked uptick in cases there. And right now, statistically, Israel really isn't doing so well. It remains pretty open, at least relative to the US. So that might be why it's staying at the level it is right now. Politically, there's a few reasons why you could say that it's happening. Cynically, you could say that, politicians were really on top of it at the beginning and have kind of not been as on top of it now. There's also a larger coalition, so there's kind of more argument internally in the Israeli government as to the direction that it should take. But yeah, I don't have a clear reason why that's happening. I wish I did, because first I was watching Israel with pride and a little envy, and now I'm a little worried about the direction things are going there with the pandemic.
And of course, COVID, it doesn't just affect people's health, and it also has a larger impact. And how has it impacted anti-Semitism? What are you seeing in terms of anti-Semitism over the last, let's say, 6 months now, both in the US and around the world?
Yeah, so, as with any crisis, people that are conspiracy-minded tend to blame the Jews. This happened during the Great Recession, and it's happening now that people are, not people at large, but people that are prone to conspiracy theory are now saying that, the Jews started the pandemic or created COVID or whatever. So that's been a trope that's kind of increased online and spread online. Kind of the other side of that coin is that, people are saying that, the Jews did this to profit from a vaccine, that George Soros did this to profit from a vaccine, etc. So those are kind of two strands, unfortunately, that we're seeing pop up online. And to take a step back, just to be clear, a lot of this has been online just because a lot of our lives are online right now. Look at what we're doing right now, right? So like, whereas in basically until February, a lot of what I was covering was anti-Semitism on the streets of New York and in New York State, where it was really spiking at the end of last year. Now the conversation has moved to anti-Semitism in virtual spaces. There's also been a phenomenon of something called Zoom bombing, where people will get into unsecured Zoom rooms at like Jewish virtual events and, say Holocaust denial statements or, otherwise anti-Semitic statements. And yeah, so I would say that those are the main ways that it's manifested so far in the pandemic. Of course, there's also, we shouldn't lose sight of, for lack of a better word, like in-person anti-Semitism on the ground. Just today, there was a man arrested in Long Island who had stockpiled weapons and threatened to attack a yeshiva day camp in Long Island because he said that they weren't practicing social distancing and weren't wearing masks. And that's something that we kind of saw earlier in the pandemic, that claim that that Hasidim or Haredim, what's known as ultra Orthodox, weren't were responsible for the spread of this, and the death toll was really high actually in those communities, but that apparently hasn't gone away because this guy appeared to be planning a real attack on this camp, and I'm thankful that he was caught and has now been apprehended.
And the COVID hasn't just impacted the Jewish community in terms of anti-Semitism. Obviously, it's impacted how people are able to connect to their shuls, to their JCCs, to their day schools, to all their Jewish institutions.
Yeah.
What do you think the long-term impact, or will there be a long-term impact in terms of, from COVID, in terms of the way people relate to Jewish institutions, how affiliated they feel?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely going to be a long-term impact. I feel like that's a question I would ask you because you're a rabbi who is dealing with this in real time. But yeah, I mean, like the easy answer is that remains to be seen because we're not out of it yet. And you can correct me on this, but I believe I read near the beginning of the pandemic that the custom, which is universal now, of everyone saying Mourner's Kaddish together, actually started, I think, during a cholera outbreak in the 19th century, when so many people, it used to be like one at a time, that people would say Kaddish one at a time, and there were so many people dying that they switched it to everyone saying it at the same time. That was really interesting to me, obviously really dark and unfortunate. I feel like a lot of this, the last couple of questions have been dark, and I'm sorry about that. But yeah, I mean, look, like, for non-Orthodox movements, a lot, services have moved online, and it remains to be seen whether that's going to stick. I think a lot of people who, use electronics on Shabbat and holidays appreciate that because it gives a lot more accessibility to people with disabilities who can't necessarily make it to shul every week, or, seniors who can't necessarily make it to shul every week. So that's really interesting. And if I were to predict something, and my predictions are always wrong, but if I were to predict something, I would predict that that's kind of here to stay. In terms of other stuff, I don't work from an office anymore. I'm not sure when the next time is that I'll work from an office. So I think that that's widespread across society, and I think that's definitely going to impact Jewish life as well. That like we don't know when Jewish organizations are going to be in physical spaces again, and then we can also get into schools and camps, which is a whole other thing. I did a lot of reporting on camp this past summer, and camps basically shifted from figuring something out for this summer to even wondering whether they're going to be around next summer. So a couple of camps were able to run and basically ran smoothly. Other camps had coronavirus outbreaks, and I think like what we're looking at for next year, and of course for school this year. I'm a parent, and I'm sure some of you are. We're not sure what Jewish day school is going to look like, whether kids are going to be able to actually go to school or not. So that might spur new models of education. But really, we're still in it. So we'll see. We're all going to live it together.
And I can just say on sort of a lighter note, I mean, one of the things I'm sure will be here to stay, and Muriel can attest to this too, is I don't know that we'll ever have an in-person board meeting again. Zoom board meetings seem to be much better attended. But so I guess asking, maybe to phrase the question in a more hopeful way or optimistic way, are you seeing in your reporting also, or hearing about new ways in which people are connecting to synagogues and Jewish institutions, or looking to connect to Jewish institutions in ways they haven't in the past? I guess online services might be one example of that, but are there other things like that come to mind?
Yeah, sure. First of all, people are going to online. Everyone I talk to, all the rabbis I talk to who hold online services, say that that people are going to them at higher rates than they would actually show up for shul in person. And I think that that's because it's that much easier, but also people really want a sense of connection now, as I'm sure you've experienced. People want to be part of a community now. We also want to be part of a community ourselves. So that's that's happening. That just because there are online services doesn't mean they're sparsely attended. I think they're actually quite well attended. So if you're someone who likes shul, that's a good thing. In terms of other stuff, I think people are really going to be experimental about the high holidays this year, which I think could lead to some cool stuff. I remember I was talking to a rabbi a couple months ago who wanted to encourage having a Rosh Hashanah Seder the first night. So we all have a Pesach Seder, but what some people might not know is that there are some communities that have a Seder for the first night of Rosh Hashanah. And, just like we have apples and honey that symbolize a sweet new year, they have all of these different things, the head of a fish, nuts, raisins, etc., that all in their Hebrew names and in what they symbolize different attributes for the new year. I remember that our family was at one of those in 2014 in Israel. We were with a family originally from Algeria, and they had not a Haggadah, but like a little booklet that everyone got that went through item by item. And we would talk about what we wanted for the new year based on different things, right? So, so like for example, a beet is a selek, right? In Hebrew, and that's sheyistalek hasatan, right? So like, not to get too far in the weeds, but that word selek is similar to the word of getting rid of something. So it was like get rid of the evil inclination, get rid of your yetzer hara. So now that we can't go to synagogue, or some people can't go to synagogue this year, that's a way to do ritual at home. Another thing is that I live in Washington Heights in Upper Manhattan, which is a large and historic Jewish community, and which I'm sure you guys can totally identify with. And I just assume that I'm going to be able to walk out on Rosh Hashanah and hear people blowing the shofar, because it's a small neighborhood with a lot of Jews and a lot of observant Jews. So I think that that's going to be really cool, actually. I think that like will have a feeling of like public ritual in a way that we didn't necessarily have in other years. So I wouldn't say I'm excited for the high holidays, because of course I want to be with my community and have big meals with our family and everything like that. But I think there are some kind of cool things that are going to come out, that people are really thinking creatively about what they're going to do this year.
I think, just to pick up on something you said, just to share the story, with everyone. What about public ritual? One of the things that struck me is that we've been holding Shabbos morning services in my backyard. And I had a neighbor stop by who I'd never met before, who lives across the street from me, pull into my house, my driveway the other day while I was out doing something. And I wasn't sure. He said, "Oh, you're holding services. I see you're holding services." And I really wasn't sure what he was going to say. Because not every, we all know stories about people not being so excited about their neighbors holding services. But he said to me, it's really meaningful for me to hear the singing on Saturday morning because my church is closed and I really enjoy hearing the prayers.
Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah.
So I think you're right. It moves us when we hear shofar in public. So it moves us, but also I think there is this act of public worship really impacts people who aren't Jewish as well, and can give a sense of community across faith lines.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see how far that goes. I know a guy who is a rabbinical student and is not Orthodox and uses Zoom and everything on the high holidays, and he posted on Facebook a little while ago. He was like, "Look, I'm not sure what I'm going to tell my neighbor because I'm going to be singing at the top of my lungs for hours on end for 3 days in the middle of September." So we'll see how that goes. He lives in a small apartment in a city, so
Hopefully he has as good a neighbor as I do.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure it'll be fine.
Yeah. Let's transition a little bit to the other, I guess, big item of news right now, which is the Democratic Convention is going on. We're in the middle of the presidential election. To ask an overly broad question, do you have a sense of how the Jewish community is responding to Vice President Biden's pick of Senator Harris as his running mate? What has been her relationship like in the past with the Jewish community in California? Where does she fit in terms of having a relationship or not having a relationship with AIPAC?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't think it's an overly broad question. Thank you for asking it. So, again, to kind of take a step back to the basics, everything points to, just like in pretty much every election for decades, the vast majority of Jews are likely to vote Democrat this year, across the board. And I'm not sure how much impact the vice presidential pick would have had on that. In terms of Kamala Harris, she has had a pretty good relationship with AIPAC. Just to start off from the end of your question, she's had a pretty good relationship with AIPAC over the past, over her career. My colleague Ron Campius, who is a DC Jewish political guru, wrote in his first piece about Kamala Harris way back in 2019 that she's more AIPAC than J Street. That, in a time when Democrats are certainly moving to the left on Israel, she's definitely more to the center in that regard. And last year, when there was some controversy over which Democrats were going and weren't going, she couldn't go to AIPAC because, just like everyone else, it was in the middle of a lot of things. It was Super Tuesday and the pandemic was starting on all these things. But she actually posed with AIPAC activists in her office to kind of plant that flag ideologically. So that was really interesting. Another big thing about Senator Harris is that she, her husband is Jewish. Doug Emhoff is her husband. And his kids, who are her stepkids, call her Mamala. So really, I'm pretty sure it's because it rhymes with Kamala, but it also happens to have that kind of Yiddish twinge to it. So there's that too. But she's had a pretty good relationship with I think her Jewish constituents during her career. And like I said, regardless, I expect the vast majority of Jews are going to be voting for Democrats this year, just like in past elections.
So is there anything that's surprising to you about the way the Jewish community as a whole, or I guess more specifically, various aspects of the Jewish community are engaging with this election in a way that's different than the past? It sounds like there are a lot of, in a way, nothing is all that different. 80% of Jews will probably vote Democrat just like they normally do. maybe 20% or so will vote Republican. I'm sure Trump will make this his strong support for Israel a big piece of his campaign, also reaching out both to Jewish community and evangelicals, and that sort of also fits into what we've seen in previous elections. So, is there anything that's different this year?
I wish there was more that was different, to be honest. I think that it's been a long campaign already, and we've kind of seen the dynamics. Like you said, each party says it's the party for the Jews. Each party is now accusing the other party of being anti-Semitic, which is never fun. And yeah, I mean, again, like I think so much is uncertain and unprecedented this year that we'll kind of see where things go. But I would really expect what are traditionally thought of as Jewish issues to remain issues in this election, and kind of very public issues. Like you said, Israel is definitely going to be an issue in the election. I think Trump is definitely going to make Israel an issue in the election, because he sees that not just as a Jewish issue, he actually sees it also as an issue for evangelicals. He just said in a speech yesterday, he said, we made Jerusalem the capital of Israel for the evangelicals, which, by the way, they didn't. If Jerusalem was already the capital of Israel. But leaving that aside, he just kind of outright said, we did that for the evangelicals. So let's not lose sight that, Israel issues do affect the Jewish vote somewhat, but really the reason why, one of the big reasons why Trump has been such an ally of the Israeli government is that, it's seen as good for his evangelical base as well. And to be honest, in terms of why Jews vote, there are certainly Jews who vote on Israel first, or where it's kind of their top issue or one of their top three issues. But for the vast majority of Jews, that really isn't true. Jews vote on the same issues the rest of Americans vote on: the economy. Now it's got to be the pandemic, things like that, jobs and healthcare and everything else. So yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind when we think about kind of the role Israel plays in the election and with Jews. But I should add, by the way, again, I feel like you guys are the experts. You live in Ohio, right? So it's very relevant for you. I'm in New York, where it honestly doesn't matter if I vote. We all know which way it's going to go, right? So you're in the battleground. So I'd love to hear from you.
So I'm going to open it up now to people to ask questions. If you want to put your questions into the chat box, I'll pose them to Ben, or you could let me know that you'd like to ask them yourself, and then I can unmute you. So I'll just give people a minute to submit a question or two. So I'm going to just start with one question we got. Someone asked, how can Jews vote for Biden? To start with a charged question for you, an easy charged question for you.
Yeah. So thank you, Larry, for asking that question. Far be it for me to tell anyone who to vote for. But I just want to note that, obviously there are strong opinions on both sides. We live in a historically polarized political environment. It's more polarized than it's ever been. And I think that's also true, I think kind of unfortunately, but I think that's also true in the Jewish community, that it's very polarized. And Larry, just like you say, how can Jews vote for Biden? I think there are Jews who say, how can Jews vote for Trump? And it's kind of been like that for the past 4 years. It was certainly like that with President Obama as well, and with President Bush, and for a long time, and I think increasingly more so. So I'm not going to enumerate why you should vote for one candidate or the other. but yeah, I mean, that question is definitely out there, and that's kind of, again, like that's something that has been going on, and I think I'm kind of, it's going to keep going on, and we're going to keep on dealing with it.
Okay, to jump topics, how have the Arab countries in general dealt with the pandemic? I know early on, Iran faced an overwhelming surge. A lot of press coverage was focused on what was happening in China and Italy and Spain, but Iran was one of the hardest hit countries. I know it's not an Arab country, but it's in the Muslim world. How have the Arab countries dealt with COVID?
Yeah, so to be honest, I don't know a ton about that. I haven't heard a lot. I know that there is vaccine development going on in the Gulf, in those countries that I was talking about, like the UAE and Qatar, which is next to it, Bahrain and and places like that. And I think that was kind of a spur to, like I said, that was a spur to Israel and the UAE signing this agreement, was to work together on that. So, there's certainly a lot of money in the Gulf from the oil industry, and I think some of that is being put toward creating a vaccine or treatment of some kind for this. So I don't know particular stats on how certain countries are doing with COVID, but that's definitely a reason why this is happening. Why this rapprochement between Israel and Arab countries is happening.
Let me just follow up. I think we have one more question here.
Mm-hmm.
So Harvey also asked another question that I wanted to pose, which is, how prevalent do you think support for BDS is now in the Democratic caucus? Obviously,
yeah,
I think
that's a question. Yeah, that's a question people are asking for sure. So as of now, currently in the House, there are 2 Democrats who support BDS out of the majority, like more than 200, I think 220, but don't quote me on that. So it's a very small percentage right now of Democrats who support BDS. But the implication of the question is right, that it does seem to be a growing trend. Cori Bush in Missouri, actually in the congressional district where I went to college, just won her primary, and she wrote on her website that she supports BDS and then deleted it. So look, either way, that's not really a good look, right? So that's a potential third. I think there's a candidate in Massachusetts in a Democratic primary who has expressed support for BDS, and among the activist wing, I think it's growing in support, and kind of like the far left activist wing. But I think there's also a caveat to that. There's actually 2 big caveats. That the broad center of the Democratic Party doesn't anywhere close to support BDS now. In fact, if you look at the Democratic platform, the progressive wing was actually really disappointed with how it went on Israel, and that's because it was actually pretty centrist on Israel, as Democrats go. It condemned settlements, which used to be a bipartisan thing, honestly, and has been a Democratic policy for a long time. But it didn't mention occupation, and it certainly didn't. It opposed BDS, in fact. And Biden opposes BDS. Harris, like I said, opposes BDS, and is pretty centrist on Israel. So yes, support for BDS is growing in the activist wing, but among the people that are leading and representing the Democratic Party now, it's not there. So this ticket, the Biden-Harris ticket, was a big victory for pro-Israel Democrats, for traditionally pro-Israel Democrats. Another thing is, when you look at the activist wing, Bernie Sanders, who, by the way, does not support BDS and has signals his opposition publicly to BDS a few times. When you look at kind of him and his followers, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley and things like that, they're certainly way more critical of Israel than Democrats were like a generation ago in the 90s. But Israel is also not really a priority of theirs. They're very much more domestically focused. which of course for conservatives comes with its own set of issues. But like AOC, for example, she's certainly less sympathetic to Israel than Democrats were a generation ago. But Israel's not like on her top 10 priorities, right? It's not a thing for her. She's much more focused domestically on social democracy and things like that. So the way I look at this is less that like the Democratic Party is becoming anti-Israel, and more that the AIPAC position, or the positions that AIPAC suggests, are no longer the default, right? So if Israel isn't an issue for you and you don't really, it's not one of your big things and not a reason that you campaigned and got elected, it used to be that you would kind of follow AIPAC's lead and follow the pro-Israel community's lead on these issues. Now that is no longer the case among Democrats. And I think that Democrats now are a lot more skeptical of Israel and a lot more willing to be critical of Israel, but there's still a meaningful distance between that and supporting a boycott of Israel. Like I've said for a bunch of things here, we'll see how it goes. But right now, BDS is very much not where the Democratic Party is at. Although, like I said, and I'm kind of repeating myself now, there are a few elected officials or people that are going to be elected who do support BDS.
Okay, so I'm going to ask, it's just 9 o'clock now, so I'm going to finish with one more question that actually I have. Just to look, as I look over in the chat, Shimon, we discussed the potential implications of the UAE-Israel deal with the impact that might have on the other Gulf countries. I think the suggestion was that it might spur similar agreements with other Gulf countries, and I'm not sure who's labeled as iPhone, but I'm going to let Ben's answer to Larry speak to that question as well. So one of the questions I've gotten lately here a lot in Cleveland as a former New Yorker or someone who was born and raised in New York is what the future of New York City is. As a result of COVID and sort of in a post-COVID world. Since you're living there in Washington Heights right now, do you have a sense of how is the city doing today? How are Jewish institutions in the city doing today, and what the future might hold?
So full disclosure, I am not currently right now in Washington Heights. I'm currently right now in Chicagoland, in the Midwest. But we're actually going back tomorrow morning. So I'm very excited to go back. But of course, we've been keeping close tabs. New York seems to be doing really well comparatively. The numbers there are really low, especially compared to where they were a few months ago. And I think things are slowly inching back to normal. I know that our shul is having outdoor services now for the first time in months. And, first of all, I should say that I grew up in the Chicago area, so I am very much aware and very much a fan of the broad American Jewish scene, and that not everything is centered in New York. That being said, there are a lot of Jews in New York, and a large portion of the Jewish community is in the New York area. And I think it's been tough in that regard. Like I said, the Hasidic community really took a huge hit earlier this year, and it is still recovering from that in many ways. But to end, I think on a hopeful note, we're really getting back to a new normal. And I think, that's a cliche, but I talk to my friends, and I'm also involved in my synagogue, and nobody threw up their hands here. And to just kind of go back to something we talked about before, I think that when the pandemic started, there was an option of saying, like, look, we couldn't have shul and it stinks and we're just going to kind of take a break. But nobody took a break, even though we're not going to services in a synagogue for the most part right now. I think that there are, that people have really not given up on finding ways to fulfill Jewish life now and to create new ways of Jewish life now. And I'm excited to see that happen in my own community. I'm excited to see that happen across the country and the world. I'm always excited to see, we talked a lot about Israeli politics. I'm a huge fan of watching what happens with Israeli religion because it really works on different rules than it does in the American Jewish community. And that's a whole other hour of talking. So I don't want to get into that right now. But suffice it to say, I just think that in addition to all of the pain and hurt that we have experienced and suffered over the past few months, and I don't want to minimize that at all. But in addition to that, I do think that people are using this opportunity to reconnect and to find new ways of being Jewish and engaging with Judaism. And to me, that's exciting in a certain way. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
I'm going to. It's a little after 9 now, so I'm going to leave it here. I know we have a couple more questions that came in, but about the not just COVID, but the impact of the urban unrest. I think that's also just from what I've heard from friends and family. Obviously, that's been challenging for the city, but I do want to leave it on. Give Ben the last word. It's been wonderful to have you with us tonight. And I know I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone has. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was really an honor. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to end the recording here.